April 2006. Medicine Hat, Alberta. Police arrive at a tidy suburban home after frantic calls from neighbors. Through the windows, they see silence where a family should be stirring for the day. What they find inside will become one of the most infamous crimes in Canadian history. Mark Richardson, 42, lies stabbed to death in the basement. His wife Deborah, 48, is upstairs in the bedroom, also killed by repeated knife wounds. And in another room, their 8-year-old son Jacob is found lifeless, hidden beneath blood-soaked blankets. The scene is so brutal that seasoned officers later admitted it was among the darkest discoveries of their careers. But something is missing. The family's eldest child, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson, is not in the house. At first, investigators fear she's been kidnapped, a surviving victim taken by whoever slaughtered her parents and brother. News alerts describe her as missing and endangered. Friends and neighbors cling to hope that she's alive, waiting somewhere to be rescued. That hope collapses within hours. Evidence surfaces suggesting Jasmine isn't a victim. She's a suspect. Police discover online accounts tied to her name, filled with gothic imagery and declarations of eternal love for a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Steinke. He styles himself as a self-proclaimed werewolf, telling friends he's hundreds of years old. Investigators begin to connect the dots: a forbidden relationship, parents who tried to intervene, and a young couple who had begun to dream of escape at any cost. The evidence doesn't just hint at rebellion. It points toward planning. Messages recovered from Jasmine's computer include discussions about removing her parents as the only way to be together. Diaries found in her bedroom echo the same themes: love that must outlive everything, even family. By the next day, the mystery of her disappearance is solved. Jasmine is found, not hiding in fear, but on the run with Jeremy. The arrest photo shocks the nation. A 12-year-old in handcuffs, accused of conspiring with her boyfriend to butcher her own family. Canadian law has never seen anything like it. At 12, Jasmine is too young to face adult sentencing. But the charges, 3 counts of first-degree murder, are as serious as the justice system allows. Headlines erupt with a single, unanswerable question: how does a child become the architect of her family's destruction? That question will dominate the trial, the community, and the lives of everyone connected to the Richardsons. Because what unfolded in that small Alberta home wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a crime that forced an entire country to reconsider how far obsession can twist innocence. Before her name filled headlines, Jasmine Richardson was a middle schooler in Medicine Hat, Alberta. Neighbors saw her as quiet, creative, and a little withdrawn, a girl still straddling the line between childhood and adolescence. Her parents, Mark and Deborah, were protective but loving, the kind of couple who showed up at school events and tried to keep their children on the right path. But as Jasmine entered her early teens, normal clashes between parent and child began to take on darker tones. She was curious, eager to grow up faster than her parents allowed, experimenting with fashion and online personas. On the surface, it looked like typical teenage rebellion. Underneath, however, it was leading her toward a relationship that would shock even those closest to her. In late 2000, he wore black trench coats, painted his face, and told people he was a self-proclaimed werewolf. To a 12-year-old, his eccentricities felt like something out of a story, dramatic, thrilling, and forbidden. Friends later testified that Jasmine became captivated. Jeremy treated her as though she was older, more mature, feeding the fantasy that she was ready to defy her parents and live on her own terms. Online, they traded messages declaring eternal love. He called her his soulmate. She described him as her destiny. To Jasmine, it wasn't a teenage crush. It was everything. Mark and Deborah saw it differently. When they discovered the relationship, they were horrified. They forbade her from seeing Jeremy, grounded her, and cut off privileges. Their goal was to protect their daughter from a man they viewed as dangerous and manipulative. But the harder they tried to intervene, the more determined Jasmine became. In her diary, she wrote about feeling trapped and misunderstood. She sketched gothic imagery, scribbling lines about love that would outlast death. Online, she adopted usernames hinting at escape and eternity. Each restriction only seemed to confirm her belief that her parents were the enemy keeping her from happiness. Investigators would later say this period marked the turning point. The conflict was no longer just about curfews or rules. It had evolved into a fantasy of escape, not by leaving home, but by removing the people standing in her way. To friends, Jasmine seemed moody but still manageable. To her parents, she was slipping further out of reach. And to Jeremy, the forbidden love only deepened the appeal. Together, the two began constructing a world where nothing could separate them. A world where even family would not stand in their way. The Richardson home was already tense by early 2000s. They had seen the emails, the dramatic drawings, the late-night secrecy. And as protective parents, they decided they had to stop it. They confronted Jasmine, laying down strict rules: no contact with Jeremy, no unsupervised internet use, and no freedom until she proved she could be trusted. For them, it was an act of protection. For Jasmine, it felt like betrayal. In her diary, she scrawled lines about being trapped, about love being torn from her hands. Online, she raged against the restrictions, painting her parents as villains determined to destroy her happiness. Jeremy's reaction only fueled the fire. Friends later testified that he cast the Richardsons as enemies in their love story. He told Jasmine they were standing between her and destiny, that they could never accept the two of them. He leaned into gothic dramatics, describing their love as eternal and fated, worth fighting for at any cost. The more her parents resisted, the deeper Jasmine's obsession grew. Instead of pulling her back, their discipline pushed her further into Jeremy's orbit. She began spending even more time on forums and chat rooms, building an identity far removed from the girl her parents thought they knew. It wasn't just rebellion anymore. It was transformation. Then came the words that prosecutors would later call the spark. In recovered chats, Jeremy wrote, "It would be so much easier if they were gone." And Jasmine replied with chilling simplicity, "I think it's a good idea." Those 7 words transformed suspicion into intent. They weren't vague threats or teenage exaggerations. They were a step into planning. In the weeks that followed, the conversations grew darker. They discussed timing, methods, and escape plans. Jasmine vented that her parents were suffocating her. Jeremy reassured her that freedom was within reach. Together, they began to imagine a world without Mark and Deborah, and even without Jacob, Jasmine's 8-year-old brother, who they believed might stand in their way. From the outside, neighbors saw a family trying to cope with a rebellious preteen. But inside Jasmine's private world, the fantasy had already begun to harden into something else. The inciting incident wasn't one fight, one diary entry, or one late-night message. It was the realization that she no longer saw her parents as guardians. She saw them as obstacles. And in the minds of a 12-year-old and a 23-year-old who thought of himself as immortal, obstacles were not endured. They were eliminated. The Richardson murders shocked Medicine Hat, but what stunned investigators most was how quickly suspicion turned inward. At first, Jasmine was treated as a missing child. Posters went up, neighbors prayed, and police searched for any sign that she had been taken. But within hours of examining the crime scene, doubts emerged. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact. Nothing was stolen. Whoever entered that home had been familiar with it. And when officers began searching Jasmine's room, they found the first cracks in the story. Her diary looked like that of a typical teenager at first glance. Doodles, gothic artwork, confessions about love. But the tone darkened quickly. Between the sketches were lines about wanting to be together forever with Jeremy Steinke, and notes about her parents being in the way. Investigators described it not as idle teenage venting, but as a manifesto of intent. On her computer, the discoveries went further. Forensic analysts pulled up online accounts Jasmine used under pseudonyms. Messages traded with Jeremy were filled with declarations of eternal devotion and discussions that prosecutors would later call planning. One chilling exchange read, "Jeremy, it will be worth it when it's just us. I think it's a good idea." Those words became a refrain at trial, projected on a courtroom screen for the jury to read in black and white. The timeline was equally damning. Investigators found search histories that included ways to kill quietly and bleach bloodstains. The searches aligned with the days leading up to the murders. They weren't random clicks in the middle of a school project. They were steps in preparation. Prosecutors emphasized the detail. Jasmine didn't just write about her frustration. She and Jeremy discussed wearing gloves, using bleach, and what to do afterward. Digital forensics recovered deleted messages, placing her in active conversation about the plan. Even the items found at the crime scene, bleach bottles, attempted cleanup, seemed to echo the words investigators had pulled from her computer. Fantasy had bled into reality, line by line. For the defense, the explanation was that Jasmine was a child wrapped up in gothic roleplay, incapable of knowing where fantasy ended and reality began. They reminded jurors that teenagers often write exaggerated things they never act on. But the prosecution countered with cold clarity. Fantasy doesn't match search histories. Fantasy doesn't leave 3 bodies in a home. For investigators, the evidence spoke for itself. Jasmine wasn't missing. She wasn't a hostage. She was, in their eyes, an active participant in the crime that destroyed her family. And in that moment, the case shifted. The innocent missing child became the unthinkable suspect, a 12-year-old accused of conspiring to kill her own parents and brother. In the first hours after the discovery, Jasmine Richardson's name was spoken with sympathy. Police alerts listed her as endangered, a child who might have been taken after watching her family perish. But the deeper investigators dug, the more that image dissolved. The turning point came when Jasmine and Jeremy Steinke were found together. They weren't hiding in fear or pleading for help. They were on the run, discovered miles away after hitchhiking and staying with friends. Witnesses recalled the sight, a 23-year-old man clutching a girl barely out of childhood, the two inseparable, speaking of a future without limits. It was not a rescue, it was an arrest. The community recoiled. Headlines shifted overnight. Missing girl found safe became 12-year-old arrested for triple murder. The nation struggled to reconcile the images, one of a child with braces and school books, and the other of a suspect accused of planning her family's deaths. Interviews with Jasmine's friends painted an unsettling picture. They remembered her speaking of Jeremy as if he were more than human, a soulmate, a figure out of fantasy. Some testified that she had confided dreams of running away, even of wishing her parents were gone. At the time, it had sounded like rebellion. After the murders, those words took on a chilling new weight. Teachers noted changes too. Jasmine had grown distracted, her work slipping. She wore darker clothes, used online aliases that hinted at escape and eternity. The transformation had seemed like a phase, until the evidence suggested it was a rehearsal for murder. For investigators, the pieces fit together. The diary, the online chats, the search history, the attempted cleanup, all pointed toward her knowledge and involvement. Jeremy may have been older, but Jasmine's words showed encouragement, not hesitation. She hadn't just been swept along. She had, in their view, taken part in steering. Prosecutors later framed her as a willing conspirator. She may have been 12, they argued, but she was not blind to what she set in motion. The age made the case unprecedented, but the evidence made it undeniable. Defense attorneys tried to shift the narrative, emphasizing her vulnerability. They argued she was manipulated by an adult who played on her immaturity, that she was a child imitating darkness without understanding its gravity. But the prosecution countered with one line: children draw hearts in diaries. Jasmine drew her family dead. By the time charges were filed, Jasmine Richardson was no longer Canada's missing daughter. She was the youngest person in the nation ever accused of first-degree murder. And in that role, she forced the country to face a question it had never asked before. What happens when the hand that destroys a family belongs to a child of 12? What happens when the hand that destroys a family belongs to a child of 12? Emotion could be dismissed as exaggeration. Testimony could be doubted. But in the Richardson case, forensic science cut through everything. The first breakthrough came from the crime scene itself. Analysts sprayed luminol across the carpet, and under ultraviolet light, streaks appeared, faint to the eye, glowing under the lamps. Patterns showed dragging rather than accidental spills. Someone had tried to clean, but bleach stains only confirmed it. To prosecutors, the very act of scrubbing proved premeditation. The autopsies added another layer. Mark and Deborah had not been surprised by a stranger in the night. They had been attacked with repeated knife strikes, their wounds consistent with rage, not random burglary. Jacob, only 8 years old, bore injuries showing he had been chased and overpowered. The brutality spoke of intent, not chance. Digital forensics told an even clearer story. Deleted messages between Jasmine and Jeremy were restored, showing not panic after the murders but planning before them. The conversations contained talk of gloves, timing, and bleach. One message from Jeremy read, "You bring the plan, I'll bring the strength." Jasmine's replies showed neither fear nor refusal, only agreement. Investigators also traced Jasmine's internet activity. Late-night searches for ways to kill quietly and clean bloodstains stood in damning contrast to her claims of innocence. The timestamps aligned with evenings she was grounded, nights when arguments with her parents were most intense. Fibers linked the crime scene to items later recovered during the investigation. Clothing in trash bags carried both Richardson family blood and microscopic traces from the home. Experts testified that even after bleach and washing, DNA remained. "The fabric remembers," one forensic analyst told the court. Defense attorneys challenged the science. They argued contamination was possible, that teenagers exaggerate in messages, that luminol can react to substances other than blood. But prosecutors countered point by point. "Perhaps," they said, "but contamination doesn't explain DNA. And fantasy doesn't leave hemoglobin behind." Jurors were shown charts, timelines, and computer logs that mapped out Jasmine's descent into planning. Every entry, every recovered message, every fiber tied her closer to the murders. What began as suspicion had now become something else entirely. Forensic science didn't care about age, innocence, or image. It cared only about evidence. And in this case, the evidence told a story that Jasmine herself could not escape. Because in the end, bleach can hide stains from the eye, but it cannot erase the truth. Every Parricide case has a turning point, the moment when conflict at home crosses the line into something irreversible. For Jasmine Richardson, that moment was her romance with Jeremy Steinke. Jeremy was 23, steeped in Gothic theatrics. He wore trench coats, painted his face, and told anyone who would listen that he was a centuries-old werewolf. To most adults, he looked delusional. But to a 12-year-old desperate for excitement, he looked like freedom. Friends would later testify that Jasmine spoke of Jeremy in mythic terms. She called him her soulmate, her destiny, the one person who understood her. He, in turn, cast their relationship as forbidden love, comparing them to Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers doomed by parental opposition. But unlike Shakespeare's tragedy, their story didn't end in self-destruction. It turned outward. Mark and Deborah Richardson recognized danger immediately. They banned Jasmine from seeing Jeremy, grounded her, and cut off privileges. They believed strict boundaries could protect her. Instead, every restriction reinforced Jeremy's narrative, that her parents were villains trying to keep them apart. The more they resisted, the deeper Jasmine fell. Her diary filled with declarations of eternal love and scribbled fantasies of a life where her parents no longer existed. Online, she adopted usernames referencing escape, eternity, and dark devotion. The fantasy wasn't just about being in love. It was about removing everything that stood in love's way. Prosecutors would later say the motive was chillingly simple. Jasmine believed she had to choose between her parents and Jeremy, and she chose Jeremy. It wasn't about money or inheritance, one attorney told the jury. It was about a girl who thought love was worth more than blood. Psychologists explained how adolescents often exaggerate feelings, framing them as absolute. At 12, Jasmine's brain lacked the impulse control and foresight of an adult. But prosecutors reminded jurors that immaturity doesn't erase intent. She hadn't just fantasized. She had encouraged and agreed. The so-called Romeo and Juliet pact became central at trial. Where Shakespeare's lovers chose death together, Jasmine and Jeremy imagined a life together, one that could only be built on the graves of her family. It was not rebellion. It was not a phase. It was obsession sharpened into motive. And that motive, prosecutors argued, turned a forbidden romance into a crime scene. When word spread that Mark, Deborah, and 8-year-old Jacob Richardson had been found murdered in their Medicine Hat home, the town fell into disbelief. At first, people thought Jasmine had been abducted. Flyers with her school photo were printed, and neighbors prayed she would be found safe. But when police announced she had been arrested as a suspect, That sympathy curdled into shock. How could a 12-year-old do this? Was the question whispered at grocery stores, workplaces, and Sunday services. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teachers who had marked Jasmine's homework weeks earlier struggled to reconcile the child they knew with the charges she now faced. Relatives of the Richardsons were crushed. Mark was remembered as a devoted father, a man who double-checked the locks every night. Deborah was described as nurturing and active in her children's lives. Jacob, only in 3rd grade, was the family's joy. For them, Jasmine had been a source of pride. To imagine her as complicit in their deaths was unbearable. The community responded with vigils. Candles lined the sidewalks, prayers filled the air, but the atmosphere was split. Some mourners spoke only of Mark, Deborah, and Jacob, refusing to mention Jasmine's name. Others wept for her too, struggling with the idea that a girl they'd watched grow up was accused of orchestrating such horror. At one service, a pastor asked, "What do we do when the one we would normally comfort is the one accused?" The silence afterwards spoke louder than any sermon. The media amplified the turmoil. Headlines labeled her Canada's youngest killer. Talk shows debated whether she was a mastermind or a manipulated child. Commentators argued over youth justice laws, pointing out that if convicted, Jasmine could only face a maximum of 10 years. For a triple homicide, critics asked, "What's that justice?" Witness testimony began to paint a clearer picture. Friends recalled Jasmine talking about Jeremy with intensity, even mentioning her wish to be with him, no matter what. At the time, they thought it was teenage melodrama. After the murders, those words became chilling. Neighbors admitted they had heard shouting, doors slamming, and seen Jasmine storm off, scenes they had dismissed as normal family conflict. Now, they wondered if those were warning signs. For investigators and prosecutors, the reaction of the community added weight to their case. It was not just about evidence anymore. It was about explaining how a child could cross the unthinkable line from fantasy to action. And for Medicine Hat, the betrayal felt personal. A daughter hadn't just lost her family. She had, according to prosecutors, chosen to erase them. The first true twist of the Richardson trial didn't come from witnesses or neighbors. It came from Jasmine's own words, her diary, her search history, and her online conversations. When prosecutors laid them before the jury, disbelief gave way to something heavier, certainty. The diary had already unsettled investigators, but in court, its contents became damning. Jurors were shown sketches that depicted her family lying dead, drawings that looked more like crime scene reenactments than teenage art. Alongside them were passages declaring her eternal devotion to Jeremy Steinke. One entry read, "My parents are the only thing standing in our way." Another hinted at the permanence she craved. "We'll be together forever, no matter what." Then came the search records. Forensic analysts projected them onto a large screen. Lines appeared one after another, ways to kill quietly, bleach blood stains, how to cover tracks after murder. The dates matched the nights leading up to April 23, 2006. It wasn't random. It was preparation. But the most chilling revelations came from her online chats. Deleted messages had been restored, and they told a story as direct as any confession. Jeremy wrote, "It will be worth it when it's just us." Jasmine replied, "I think it's a good idea." Those 7 words became a refrain throughout the trial, echoed by prosecutors who framed them as proof of intent. Emails painted the same picture. In one, Jasmine described her frustration with her parents and her desire to be with Jeremy without interference. In another, she joked about ideas for how to get rid of them. To jurors, the language wasn't vague. It was deliberate. The defense worked desperately to diffuse the impact. They argued the diary entries were fantasy roleplay, the kind of exaggerated venting common in adolescence. They said the internet searches could have been curiosity, not intent. They reminded the court that teenagers write and say things they don't fully mean. But prosecutors pressed back with bluntness. Fantasy doesn't buy bleach. Fantasy doesn't leave 3 people dead in a home. The evidence presentation became the defining moment of the trial. Jurors sat in silence as the words appeared on screen. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even courtroom veterans admitted the disconnect was hard to process. a child's handwriting and chat logs describing a plan that ended in murder. And for the public, this was the moment disbelief ended. Jasmine wasn't just the youngest defendant Canada had ever seen for first-degree murder. She was also the one whose own words had built the case against her. Because when the truth came out, it wasn't whispered by witnesses. It was written in her own hand. The evidence had spoken loudly enough. Within days of the murders, police shifted from searching for a missing child to hunting down a suspect. Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke were tracked to a small town just outside Medicine Hat. They had been hiding with friends, hitchhiking, and speaking openly about their plan for a new life together. When officers stormed the location, the sight was surreal. Jeremy, 23, still dressed in gothic black, wrapped himself protectively around Jasmine. She looked impossibly young, a 12-year-old whose feet barely touched the ground when seated in the police car. To witnesses, it was a picture that defied belief. The alleged masterminds of a triple homicide looking more like a mismatched couple than fugitives. The arrest photos made front-page headlines across Canada. "Child killer," screamed one. "12-year-old charged in family massacre," read another. Images of Jasmine in handcuffs flooded the news cycle, sparking debates about whether such a young girl could truly comprehend what she had done. Inside the interrogation room, contradictions emerged. Police records showed Jasmine initially denying involvement. She claimed Jeremy had acted alone, that she had no part in planning the murders. But when investigators confronted her with diary passages and recovered messages, her explanations faltered. At times she appeared detached, at others defensive. Prosecutors later argued these shifting responses reflected guilt, not confusion. Jeremy's interrogation was even more bizarre. He bragged to detectives, describing himself as a misunderstood anti-hero, comparing his love with Jasmine to Romeo and Juliet. In his version, Jasmine was not a victim but an equal partner. His words, prosecutors said, removed any doubt about her complicity. Prosecutors moved quickly. Jasmine was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, making her the youngest defendant in Canadian history to face such accusations. Because she was only 12, Canadian law protected her from adult sentencing. The maximum penalty under the Youth Criminal Justice Act was 10 years, 6 in custody, 4 under supervision. For many in the community, the thought of just 10 years for 3 lives felt incomprehensible. Outside the courthouse, protests formed. Some demanded tougher laws. Others argued Jasmine was still a child, incapable of the cold calculation prosecutors described. The debate became national. Was she a monster or a manipulated girl? For investigators, however, the arrest and charges marked a turning point. Jasmine was no longer a missing child or a grieving survivor. She was officially the accused, a girl whose own words and choices had placed her in the defendant's chair. And for the country, the sight of a 12-year-old facing charges of parricide became a question without precedent. Because Canada had never before asked whether a child could stand trial for wiping out her entire family. By 2007, the case of Jasmine Richardson had grown into one of the most followed trials in Canadian history. The courtroom in Medicine Hat was filled with reporters, grieving relatives, and a community desperate for answers. The question was simple but staggering. What kind of justice could possibly fit a 12-year-old accused of wiping out her own family? The prosecution's opening statement was blunt. They painted Jasmine not as a manipulated child, but as an active partner who had chosen Jeremy Steinke over her parents. They projected diary entries, emails, and chat logs onto the courtroom screens, forcing jurors to read her own words back to her. She wasn't dragged into this, the prosecutor said. She encouraged it. The defense countered with an appeal to age and vulnerability. They described Jeremy as a manipulative adult who preyed on a child's immaturity. Psychologists testified about adolescent development, explaining that at 12, the brain lacks the full ability to weigh consequences or resist influence. She was still a child, one expert told jurors. She could not fully grasp the permanence of her decisions. But the evidence loomed large. Jurors saw the timeline of messages leading up to the murders, the drawings of her family lying dead, and the incriminating search history. Witnesses recalled her obsession with Jeremy, her language about wanting her parents gone. The prosecution argued these weren't random teenage outbursts. They were a blueprint. Outside the courtroom, debate raged. Some demanded adult sentencing, furious that 3 lives could be answered with only 10 years of punishment. Others argued that the law was clear. Children must be treated as children, even in the most horrific circumstances. Editorials split between outrage and sympathy. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came. Jasmine Richardson was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, bound by Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, handed down the maximum sentence available, 10 years. 6 to be spent in a psychiatric facility, followed by 4 under strict community supervision. His words acknowledged the paradox. "You were 12 years old," he told her. "The law cannot treat you as an adult, but this court recognizes the devastating weight of your actions." For the families of Mark, Deborah, and Jacob, the sentence felt impossibly light. For legal scholars, it became a landmark, a case study in how youth justice balances accountability with mercy. And for the nation, Jasmine Richardson's verdict left an image it could never erase. A child whose crimes were judged not by the standard of adulthood, but by the protections of youth law. In Alba, Texas, the Caffey family looked like the embodiment of small-town faith. Terry and Penny Caffey raised their children in the church, attended Sunday services, and emphasized values of discipline and devotion. Their daughter Erin, 16 years old, was known as the quiet girl who sang hymns with her mother and seemed obedient to the point of shyness. But by the winter of 2008, Erin was no longer the sheltered girl her community thought they knew. She had fallen in love with Charlie Wilkinson, a 19-year-old whose reputation carried a darker edge. Friends described him as reckless, prone to anger, and fiercely possessive of Erin. Where her parents saw danger, Erin saw excitement, the kind of forbidden romance that made her feel older than her years. When Terry and Penny discovered the relationship, they acted quickly. They grounded Erin, cut off her phone privileges, and insisted she end things with Charlie. For them, it was an act of protection. For Erin, it felt like betrayal. Text messages later recovered from her phone revealed the depth of her obsession. She vented to Charlie that her parents were ruining everything, that she just wanted to be with him, and that life would be better if they were gone. In one chilling exchange, Charlie told her, "We can fix this." Erin replied, "Do it." Prosecutors would later argue those 2 words became the motive for everything that followed. Friends testified that Erin spoke constantly about Charlie, framing him not as a boyfriend but as her destiny. She compared their relationship to something eternal, untouchable, worth any price. For her, parental restrictions only intensified the fantasy. The harder Terry and Penny tried to intervene, the more determined she became to escape. Prosecutors described this as the seed of her motive. Obsession sharpened into rebellion. Rebellion twisted into destruction. They told jurors, this was not an accident. This was a daughter who decided her parents' love was the problem and demanded it be removed. The defense, even in opening statements, countered that Erin was a manipulated teenager. They pointed to Charlie's influence, his pressure, his role as the older figure who turned adolescent frustration into homicidal planning. Psychologists testified about the volatility of teenage emotion, how immaturity can exaggerate feelings into absolutes. But the text messages, the calls, and Erin's own words hung over everything. "Do it," she had written. And when Charlie took her seriously, the line between rebellion and murder disappeared. In the early hours of March, inside the modest wooden home of the Caffey family, a nightmare unfolded that would leave the small town scarred forever. Charlie Wilkinson and his friend Charles Wade forced their way inside, armed and ready. They had gasoline cans in their car, guns in their hands, and Erin Caffey's encouragement echoing in their heads. She was waiting outside, sitting in a vehicle nearby, as the plan she had demanded began to unfold. Penny Caffey, Erin's mother, was the first target. She was shot in her bedroom, unable to fight back. Her sons, Matthew, 13, and Tyler, 8, were awakened by the chaos. Terrified, they tried to escape, but they too were cornered. Both were killed before the attackers turned their focus elsewhere. Her father, Terry, woke to the sound of gunfire. He was shot multiple times but miraculously survived. Barely conscious, bleeding heavily, He managed to crawl through the woods in the dead of night. Step by agonizing step, he reached a neighbor's house and collapsed on the porch. His words to the emergency responders stunned everyone. "My daughter is involved." The killers didn't stop at gunfire. Before leaving, they set the house ablaze. Flames consumed the wooden structure, rising high enough that neighbors rushed out of their homes, horrified to see the Caffey residence swallowed by fire. By the time firefighters arrived, the home was gone. Only ashes and charred ruins remained, a crime scene drenched in smoke and grief. When investigators arrived, they pieced together the sequence. Bullet casings matched the weapons Wilkinson and Wade carried. Gasoline traces lined the house, proof that the fire had been deliberate. And in interviews, both young men admitted Erin's role. They told detectives she had begged for it, that she insisted life could only begin if her parents were gone. The community of Alba struggled to process the horror. The Caffeys were known as church-going, faithful, deeply devoted to their children. Erin herself had been seen just days earlier singing hymns at a youth service. Now she stood accused of orchestrating the destruction of her family by bullets and fire. For prosecutors, the crime was clear. Erin had not pulled the trigger, but she had lit the fuse. Without her demand, there would have been no invasion, no bodies, no fire. And for Terry, the lone survivor, the night was both an ending and a beginning. He had lost his wife and sons, his home reduced to ash. And now he faced the unbearable truth that the daughter he had once tucked into bed had chosen to erase them all. When Erin Caffey's trial began, the prosecution's strategy was straightforward. Show the jury that although she hadn't fired the shots or lit the fire, she had asked for it, and her words had been enough to set the plan in motion. Their first key witnesses were the very people who carried out the attack. Charlie Wilkinson, Erin's 19-year-old boyfriend, took the stand. His demeanor was defiant, almost smug, but his testimony was devastating. He admitted to killing Penny, Matthew, and Tyler, but placed the responsibility at Erin's feet. "She wanted them gone," he told the court. "She told me we couldn't be together unless they were out of the way." Next came Charles Wade, the friend who had joined the assault. His account matched Charlie's. He described Erin as determined, not hesitant. He claimed she had promised them freedom once her parents were gone. Though the defense pressed him hard on inconsistencies, Wade's calm delivery carried weight. The defense tried to dismantle both testimonies. They argued the young men had motive to shift blame, especially under plea deals. They highlighted Charlie's older age, suggesting he manipulated Erin into believing violence was the only solution. They reminded the jury that she had been only 16, still a minor, vulnerable to influence. But the prosecution countered with digital evidence. Jurors were shown Erin's text messages and call logs in which she vented about her parents and encouraged Charlie. One message loomed largest, her blunt instruction: "Do it." Prosecutors repeated it like a mantra, reminding jurors that while words are intangible, they had triggered very real destruction. Cross-examination grew heated when defense attorneys suggested Charlie acted on his own. Prosecutors pressed him. If Erin hadn't asked for it, would he have gone through with the killings? He shook his head. No, she wanted it. That's why it happened. Forensic experts reinforced the chain of evidence. Gasoline traces, bullet casings, and fire patterns confirmed the physical crime scene aligned perfectly with the story prosecutors told. The science left little space for alternate theories. Observers described the courtroom atmosphere as electric. On one side sat Terry Caffey, the lone survivor, listening to the people who had destroyed his family place the blame on his daughter. On the other side sat Erin, quiet, often avoiding eye contact, her expression unreadable. By the close of the cross-examinations, jurors were left with two stark portraits: a vulnerable teenager manipulated by an older boyfriend, or a calculating daughter who valued romance above blood. And whichever version they believed, the evidence suggested the same conclusion. Erin had not pulled the trigger, but she had given permission. And permission was all it took. By the spring of 2000, defense attorneys painted her as a manipulated minor whose immaturity was exploited by an older boyfriend. The jury had to decide which portrait to believe, mastermind or manipulated. When deliberations began, jurors faced little doubt about the crime itself. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade had confessed to carrying out the killings. The physical evidence tied them to the fire and the gunshots. What mattered most now was Erin's role. Did she simply vent teenage frustration, or had she ordered her family's deaths? The text messages left little ambiguity. Prosecutors circled back to her 2 words: do it. They argued those words were not fantasy or exaggeration. They were an order, one that directly preceded the slaughter of her mother and 2 brothers, and the near-fatal shooting of her father. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Erin Caffey was found guilty of capital murder. But because of her age, the death penalty was off the table. Instead, the judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive life sentences, with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. She would not be eligible for release until she was in her 50s. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Erin's face remained blank, though reporters noted a faint tremor in her hands. For the families of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler, it was a measure of justice, but never enough to fill the void left by their loss. Then came the twist that stunned observers. Terry Caffey, the lone survivor, publicly announced he had forgiven his daughter. He explained that his Christian faith demanded it, that bitterness would destroy him if he held on to hate. "I lost my wife and sons that night," he said quietly. "I won't lose my daughter too." His words drew outrage from some and admiration from others. Critics argued that forgiveness cheapened the loss of Penny and the boys. Supporters said it was the only way a man so devastated could continue living. Either way, it reframed the story. This was no longer just about guilt and punishment. It became a tale of a father's refusal to abandon his child, even after she had destroyed everything. For prosecutors, Erin's sentence was proof that justice had been served. For defense attorneys, it was a grim reminder that youth offers no shield when crimes are this severe. And for the world, Erin Caffey became a symbol of the darkest collision between teenage obsession and familial destruction, tempered only by the extraordinary grace of the father who chose to forgive her. By 2000 to classmates, she was the quiet girl with dark jokes. But beneath that surface was a storm no one had fully understood until it erupted in blood. Alyssa's upbringing was marked by instability. Her mother struggled with addiction, her father cycled in and out of prison, and Alyssa was placed in her grandparents' care. Outwardly, they gave her stability, a home, schooling, structure. But inside, Alyssa fought with depression and violent impulses. She cut herself, journaled about death, and searched online for ways to silence the chaos in her head. Friends later testified that she spoke openly about wanting to kill. At first, they thought she was joking. Teenagers, after all, sometimes flirt with dark humor. But Alyssa's fascination went deeper. She dug shallow graves in the woods behind her home, an act dismissed by peers as creepy but harmless. It wasn't. Those holes would later become evidence of premeditation. On October 21st, the horror only deepened when investigators uncovered Alyssa's journal. In one entry, written the night of the murder, she described killing Elizabeth in blunt, chilling language. She ended it with a single word: "Ah." For prosecutors, this wasn't just evidence. It was a confession, a window into the mindset of a teenager who seemed to treat murder as an experiment. Neighbors and classmates reeled at the news. How could a 15-year-old, a girl known for babysitting younger kids, a girl who attended church with her grandparents, turn into a killer? The case shocked Missouri not only for its brutality, but for its perpetrator. A teenager who killed not for money, not for love, but seemingly for curiosity. As the trial approached, prosecutors promised to expose Alyssa's darkness in full. They would show the graves, the journal, the cold language of a girl who, in their words, wanted to know what it felt like to kill. And when those words reached the jury, America would once again confront an unsettling question. What happens when a child kills, not for need or survival, but for thrill? When Alyssa Bustamante's trial began in Jefferson City, Missouri, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat, parents held their children close, and the family of 9-year-old Elizabeth Alton braced for details they could barely stand to hear. Prosecutors wasted no time delivering the most haunting piece of evidence, Alyssa's journal. Written in teenage handwriting, the entry describing Elizabeth's murder was read aloud to the jury. Alyssa had recorded the act with disturbing detachment. noting how she strangled her victim, slit her throat, and buried her in one of the shallow graves she had dug days earlier. She ended with a single word underlined. Ah. That sigh, prosecutors argued, was not horror. It was satisfaction. Jurors saw the actual notebook, its pages marked with doodles and confessions. Prosecutors framed it as a window into Alyssa's psyche. This wasn't a crime of passion or panic, they said. It was calculated, rehearsed, and relished. Investigators also testified about the graves behind Alyssa's house. 2 shallow pits had been dug in advance, one used for Elizabeth, another waiting. Photos of the holes were shown, and prosecutors pressed the point. This was premeditation, not accident. She didn't stumble into this, one attorney told jurors. She prepared for it. The autopsy results were presented clinically, but the impact was crushing. The medical examiner confirmed Elizabeth had suffered strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The injuries aligned exactly with Alyssa's journal entry, proving her words weren't fantasy but fact. Digital forensics added further weight. Alyssa's internet history included searches about homicide and discussions with friends about her fascination with death. Witnesses testified that she had talked openly about wanting to kill just to see what it felt like. At the time, her peers had dismissed it as teenage shock value. Now it read like a confession in plain sight. The defense argued Alyssa was a deeply troubled child suffering from depression and untreated mental health issues. Psychologists described her history of self-harm, her parents' instability, and the lack of consistent care. They claimed the murder was the tragic outburst of a broken mind, not a deliberate act of evil. But the journal, the graves, and the chilling precision of her words overshadowed their plea. Prosecutors countered, depression explains sadness. It doesn't explain digging graves. The clash in court was stark. Was Alyssa a damaged teen who cracked under mental illness, or a budding sociopath who found satisfaction in killing? For Elizabeth's family, the answer didn't matter. They had lost a child who had been walking home from a friend's house, a normal girl in a normal town, whose path crossed with a teenager's darkest fantasy. And for the jury, the evidence was overwhelming. Alyssa's own handwriting had sealed her fate. By the time closing arguments began, the jurors had already seen more than enough to haunt them. Alyssa Bustamante's journal, the shallow graves, the autopsy photos, and testimony from friends who recalled her fascination with death. What remained was the legal fight over how to interpret it, as the act of a broken child or the deliberate crime of a calculated killer. The prosecution's tone was uncompromising. They reminded the jury of Alyssa's own words, projected on the courtroom screen for the final time. I strangled her. I slit her throat. I stabbed her. Ah. The attorney let the silence hang before driving the point home. That is not the writing of a child who lost control. That is the writing of someone who found satisfaction in killing. They argued the 2 shallow graves were proof beyond doubt. One grave was filled, another was waiting. How much more planning do we need to see before we call this what it is? Premeditated murder. For the defense, the strategy was different. They didn't deny the crime. They couldn't. Instead, they appealed to the jury's sense of mercy. Psychologists testified again about Alyssa's long battle with depression, her history of self-harm, and her unstable family background. They argued that her violent outburst was the result of untreated illness, not cold-blooded evil. If you sentence her as if she were an adult predator, the defense pleaded, you ignore the child who was failed long before this act. They asked jurors to consider her age, 15. They reminded them that Alyssa still doodled in the margins of her notebooks, still wore bracelets to cover scars from cutting, still vacillated between childish immaturity and teenage rebellion. She is not beyond saving, one defense attorney insisted, but the prosecution countered with the community's wound. Elizabeth Alton's family sat in the front row, faces etched with grief. A 9-year-old had been lured into the woods and never returned. Elizabeth will never grow up, the prosecutor said. She will never graduate. She will never have the chance to be saved. The law demands justice. The jury deliberated with the weight of both arguments. Sympathy for Alyssa's broken childhood battled against horror at the crime itself. Yet in the end, the evidence, the journal, the graves, the chilling detail, overshadowed pleas for leniency. When the verdict was read, Alyssa Bustamante was found guilty of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole plus 30 years. She would spend decades behind bars before she could even request release. And as the sentence echoed through the courtroom, the lesson was clear. Her age had saved her from a harsher punishment, but it had not saved her from the consequences of her crime. Years have passed since the headlines first screamed about these daughters who turned on their families, but their names still echo whenever people ask how justice handles children who kill. Each case has taken a different path, shaped by age, law, and circumstance. Jasmine Richardson served her sentence under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. She spent several years in a psychiatric facility, and the remainder under supervised release. In 2016, a decade after the murders, she completed her sentence at just 22 years old. According to reports, she pursued higher education and counseling, seeking anonymity under new legal protections. She has expressed remorse in limited hearings, but because of Canadian law, her name can no longer be tied to current details. For Medicine Hat, the memory of 2006 never faded, but legally, Jasmine's punishment is complete. Erin Caffey, now in her 30s, remains incarcerated in Texas. Her sentence, 2 consecutive life terms plus parole eligibility after 40 years, means she will not walk free until at least her mid-50s. Prison records confirm she has participated in faith-based programs and counseling, echoing the forgiveness offered by her father, Terry, who still visits her. But for many, that forgiveness remains controversial. Survivors and relatives of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler argue that no program or faith statement erases the reality of 3 lives lost and a family burned to the ground. Alyssa Bustamante is still serving her life sentence in Missouri. Though eligible for parole after a legislative change in 2012, she faces decades before any realistic chance of release. In prison, she has reportedly continued mental health treatment, with psychologists describing her as deeply troubled but capable of long-term rehabilitation. Elizabeth Alton's family, however, has fought against any leniency, insisting that Alyssa's crime was so deliberate and her journal so chilling that parole would never feel like justice. Together, their cases form a grim spectrum of outcomes. Jasmine, once the youngest person in Canada convicted of multiple murders, is now free, her sentence capped by youth law. Erin lives out her punishment in the Texas prison system, her father's forgiveness her only lifeline. Alyssa, barely 15 when she killed, faces the possibility of dying behind bars. For society, the updates are reminders of the paradox at the heart of these crimes. They were children when they killed, but they left wounds as deep as any adult murderer. The law responded with mercy in some cases, severity in others, but the debate over what is just has never truly ended. And for the families of Mark and Deborah Richardson, Penny and Terry Caffey, and Elizabeth Alton, the present is not measured in legal updates or parole hearings. It is measured in the silence left by those who never came home. In every courtroom where these trials played out, the same question hovered over judges, jurors, and families. What drives a child to kill the very people who gave them life? The stories of Jasmine Richardson, Erin Caffey, and Alyssa Bustamante stand as some of the most disturbing answers. 3 teenagers from 3 different corners of North America, each driven by obsession, rebellion, or morbid curiosity, and each leaving devastation that can never be undone. For Jasmine, it was the intoxicating pull of forbidden love. At 12, she believed romance with an older man mattered more than her parents' lives. For Erin, it was a desperate need to cling to a boyfriend, her loyalty to him outweighing loyalty to her own family. For Alyssa, it was thrill-seeking turned fatal, her curiosity about death crossing the line into action. Though their motives differed, the impact was the same. Shattered homes, grieving relatives, and communities left to ask how childhood innocence could warp into such darkness. The legal outcomes only deepened the debate. Jasmine, protected by Canada's youth laws, is now free. Erin, condemned by Texas courts, faces decades of prison time before parole. Alyssa, tried as an older teen, will likely spend her life behind bars. 3 girls, 3 sentences, each reflecting not just their crimes but the laws and values of their societies. For families, the pain never ended. The Richardsons' relatives live with absence at every holiday. Terry Caffey still walks with the memory of a house consumed by fire and the forgiveness he chose to give his daughter. Elizabeth Alton's family continues to fight parole hearings to keep Alyssa confined, their 9-year-old forever frozen in memory. What these cases leave behind is not just legal precedent. They are warnings, reminders of how vulnerable adolescents are to influence, obsession, and untreated mental illness. They also remind us how justice bends when the guilty are children, caught between accountability and mercy. Prosecutors in each case closed their arguments with the same refrain: age does not erase consequence. And in each courtroom, jurors agreed. Childhood did not shield these girls from responsibility. Yet the most haunting legacy is not legal. It is emotional. Communities still light candles. Parents still clutch their children tighter. And survivors still wake to an emptiness that no sentence, no parole board, no law can ever fill. Because when daughters kill their parents, the crime doesn't end in the courtroom. It lingers in memories, in grief, and in the silence of the homes left behind.